So, let me get vulnerable with y'all for a moment. One of my most unfortunate habits is my nervous laugh. If you spend any time with me, you know exactly what that nervous laugh sounds like. Now, I'm sure many of you find it endearing, but sometimes, however, that nervous laugh will betray me. Sometimes that laugh will come out when something is clearly not funny. I probably do this because I was the firstborn child in a very dysfunctional family. My mom used to say, we put the fun in dysfunctional, and she said it a lot. I think I developed this laugh as a way of diffusing tense situations, just trying to keep things light when they got heavy, which sometimes can be helpful, but other times it communicates something that I'm not quite feeling. Case in point, I laughed at a man who lost his dog this week. Let me explain. About 10 years ago, Heather and I spent Christmas with my sister in Florida. At the time, we had 2 rescue dogs with some serious trauma. Before going to Florida, we dropped the dogs off with my mother-in-law all the way in Kentucky because she was the only person we could trust with our super high-maintenance dogs. 2 days into the vacation, the dogs jimmied open the door and escaped. The first day, we weren't worried about it too much. It happened before, they love Heather's mom, and we were certain they would come back. But as one day went by, and another, and then another, my mother-in-law frantically searching for them all day and night while we were 15 hours away in Florida, the anxiety and the worry and the pain in the pits of our stomachs got worse and worse. One of the darkest nights of my marriage was helplessly laying in bed next to Heather while she wept bitterly about her lost dogs. Worst Christmas vacation ever. Beat that, Chevy Chase. We did eventually find them, so we can laugh about it now. We did eventually find them. Heather's mom, when she saw them in a creek, and she ran down the hill with the phone on, and we're like, "What's happening?" And it was the most harrowing 90-second phone call I've ever had. And I know it's just a couple of dogs, but those helpless, anxious feelings were some of the most painful feelings I've ever had. I've always said that losing a dog is as painful as losing a family member. The only difference is that the grief is a little quicker, right? The grief is, you get over it a little bit sooner. But it's painful. It was so painful. Which brings me to this poor man that I laughed at this week. I'm sure many of you had seen on the Pleasant View Facebook group this week about a man from Indiana who lost his poodle. He came into town for the birth of his grandson, and this big, beautiful white poodle ran away from their daughter's house over by Sycamore High School. On Tuesday, my son comes running into the house to tell me that there's a man in a red car who wanted to speak to me, which scared me a little bit. Immediately, though, I could tell that this man was not okay. But he was very polite, and he asked if he could get out of his car and speak to me. And so when he did, he handed me his phone, and it was a picture of his dog in my yard. Apparently somebody driving down 41A had snapped a picture of it. So he came by to investigate. And so we walked around the property together, and I walked him across the neighbor's yard, into the neighbor's yard, because they have a garbage pile in their backyard, and when my dogs are missing, they're usually back there in the garbage pile. But we didn't find him. The whole time we were walking around the yard, the poor man kept telling me the whole story about losing his dog. He just ran out the door. He'd been seen limping around. I bet he'd been hit by a car. He saw him from a distance, but then the dog ran away from him. And he's like, I should have just sat and waited for him, but I chased after him. You know, my grandson was just born. I just want to spend time with him. I don't care how much it costs. He kept saying this over and over again. I don't care how much it costs. I just want to find my dog. Over and over again, with his hands shaking and his voice trembling, he kept telling me these same details over and over and over again as we walked my property. The whole thing brought me back to that awful Christmas in Florida. Every detail of his story, his painful feelings, and his cluttered speech were so familiar. I had been there. I could feel those old knots in my stomach start to twist again. I didn't know this guy from Adam, My 3-year-old was in the house watching Paw Patrol. My boys were unsupervised playing on the trampoline out in the yard. And I had dinner on the stove, and Heather was going to come home any minute to see this mess. I had just gotten home from a long day of work. I just didn't have anything to offer this man. I just couldn't go there. And so out came my nervous laugh. He would again tell me about how close he was to catching the dog, about his theories about why his dog was limping, and that time he was missing with his grandson. And I'd just kind of chuckle at him and say, yeah, man, that's terrible. I've been there before. And every time I responded like that, he seemed to repeat himself with even more emotion. It was as if he was trying to tell me, I don't think you heard me. Listen to me again. But in that awkward space of sitting with a heartbroken stranger and needing to get back to my kids who were in the house and get dinner on the table, my nervous laugh was all I had to offer this poor man. As I've said, today is Transfiguration Sunday. Historically, the church reads the story on the last Sunday before Lent. Perhaps it's offered as something to aspire to or focus on as we delve into the drudgery of our Lenten disciplines. Maybe getting through no coffee for 40 days. The Transfiguration story can help motivate me or something. In Luke's telling of this story, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up to a mountain, and he transforms before them. The appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became a dazzling white, in verse 29. Moses and Elijah then appear, symbols of the law and the prophets, the two ways that God has spoken to his people. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell the same story. However, Luke is the only gospel that mentions what these men discuss with each other. In this telling, it says that Moses and Elijah discuss with Jesus his departure. The Greek word here is Exodus, as in the Hebrew people being liberated from Egyptian slavery. Perhaps just as Moses led the people out of Egypt, Jesus' departure will be about liberation as well. Perhaps liberation from the bondage of sin and death. The awe of this moment is broken up when Peter speaks. Something about his idea to build dwellings triggers a second audible sound of God's voice. The first one happening at Jesus' baptism when God said, "This is my son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." Clearly, Peter's suggestion is out of line. The text makes sure to tell us that Peter doesn't know what he's talking about. Verse 33. But what is so bad about Peter's idea? This moment probably reminded Peter of Mount Sinai when the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness. After all, Moses was on that mountain for 40 days. So naturally, if this is like that, maybe they should set up camp. Luke's gospel has a way of telling stories like this, though, with one eye on Jesus and one eye on history. Many of Luke's stories have an Old Testament counterpart, where God has acted and rescued people in similar ways. By doing this, Luke is training us to see the movement of God unfold through time. In Luke's gospel, if Jesus says or does something, it's probably an echo of something that happened in the Old Testament. Luke's prevailing argument here is, if Jesus is God, shouldn't their actions and words look similar to one another? What Luke will often do, though, is bend the expectations of the story in such a way to reveal a particularity about Jesus. Here, in the person of Jesus Christ, God speaks for God's self, not through a prophet or a sign. And what gets revealed in Jesus is that little piece that maybe humans have been overlooking this whole time. And so Luke's gospel is alluding this transfiguration back to Moses on Mount Sinai in the middle of the book of Exodus. So if we compare this story with the Mount Sinai story, there are some very interesting differences. First, Moses goes up to Mount Sinai alone, whereas Jesus brings with him 3 disciples. When God speaks to Moses on Mount Sinai, he delivers 10 commandments. To Jesus, God has just one. This is my son, listen to him. And when Moses comes down from the mountain, he sees that the Israelites have started a new cult, and made a golden calf for their new god. And Exodus 32 says this: as soon as Moses came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot. And he threw the tablets from his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. He took the calf that they made, burned it with fire, ground it into a powder, scattered it on the water, and made the Israelites drink it. Oof, such wrath. I have trouble with that story. Moses is furious at the Israelites, and he violently punishes them for their faithlessness and perversion. In Luke, when Jesus and his companions come down from the mountain, they're also confronted with something that makes Jesus angry. Luke says that when they came down from the mountain, they were immediately confronted by a man with a sick boy and his disciples. While they were on the mountain, his disciples tried to heal the sick boy, but they were unable to. And Jesus responds by saying, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you?" Again, an echo of Moses' words. Unlike in Exodus, Jesus' followers did not betray God. In fact, they were earnestly trying to do his work in his absence. And instead of punishing people in his anger like Moses did, Jesus shows mercy and heals the boy. But why is Jesus so angry? Let's look at the differences one more time. Moses went up alone. Jesus brought companions. Moses was angry. The Israelites made their own gods. Jesus was angry. The disciples couldn't do the work of God in his absence. Clearly, Luke is making an argument about community. Following the way of Jesus is not a solo act. It is done together. And so on Wednesday this week, I was standing by some of the parents during my son's baseball practice. And one parent said to another, "Did that guy find his dog yet?" I interjected, and I may have been bragging a little. "You know, he came by my house yesterday, and I have his phone number." So I texted him, and he said that he had spent the whole day working with a professional animal trapper and was hopeful that he might find him the next day, on Thursday. And so Thursday, I got home from work, and I was planning to go to the gym. I changed my clothes and grabbed my keys, and just as I was walking out the door, I got an alert on my Ring app, which is, the doorbell app. They have a neighborhood feature, which, is sometimes helpful. One of my neighbors had announced that they saw a white poodle walking down Pinnacle Road over by the old manufacturing building just 2 minutes ago. I went back in my house, grabbed my dog treats and a leash, and I got in my truck and slowly drove up and down Pinnacle Road, a whole loop, for about an hour. But I didn't find him. I texted the owner a screenshot of the alert, and he thanked me for helping him. But then when I went back to the app, I saw that the alert had comments. I clicked the comment icon on the alert and saw dozens of people had commented with something along the lines of, "This man is from out of town. If you see the dog again, call this number." Then I flipped over to the Pleasant View Facebook page, and there were hundreds of comments and photos of people spotting the dog and trying to coordinate the rescue of this animal. Think about this for a second. What do you all think all this says about how hungry people are for meaningful ways to serve one another? And so the Transfiguration story is pointing us to community, to a way that is all about doing meaningful work together. If it is an essential part of our exodus from enslavement to sin and death, if it's about building sacred community with one another, what then do we do when we get everybody together? As I said earlier, Moses was given 10 commandments. Jesus and his disciples were given just one. "This is my son, listen to him." But here's the peculiar thing. Other than the brief chat with Moses and Elijah, Jesus himself doesn't say anything to Peter, James, and John on that mountain. In the following story, when the disciples couldn't heal the boy, Jesus says, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer will I be with you?" And I'm not sure all that glorious, dazzling white was to deliver that message. But if we pull back the story and look at the events just before and just after the Transfiguration, I believe we have our answer. Jesus takes his disciples up to the mountain and unveils his plan to undergo great suffering, be killed, and raised on the third day. Verses 23 through 24 of chapter 9 says this. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me daily. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will save it. And then, right after they come off the mountain, and Jesus heals the boy, and everyone's amazed, Jesus turns to his disciples and says it again. Let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into human hands. Verse 44. And Luke's gospel says that his disciples didn't understand a word he was saying. Listen to him. To listen to Jesus means we take seriously his call to suffer with him, to carry your cross and follow him daily. Jesus says it once. Then the voice of God demands that we pay attention to it. Then Jesus says it again. Suffer and die with me. So how do we do that exactly? Well, throughout Luke's gospel, Jesus tells us. In Jesus' first sermon in Nazareth, he tells the congregation he's come to bring good news to the poor, to set the captives free, recovery of sight to the blind, and let the oppressed go free. And then he says, today is fulfilled in your hearing. Last week we read the Sermon on the Plain in chapter 6, where Jesus tells us to love our enemies, do good to those who hate us, and pray for those who abuse us. He begins that sermon by saying that the poor, the hungry, those who mourn are blessed, for they will be filled, they will laugh, theirs will be the kingdom of God. Everywhere you turn in Luke's gospel, he's healing the sick, feeding the poor, touching the unclean, again and again and again, drawing our attention to the margins, to the least of these in our midst. To carry your cross and follow Jesus is a call to suffer with Christ. To suffer with Christ means we suffer with one another because Christ is our suffering. Christ is the poor, the sick, the oppressed, and the heartbroken right next to you. To be human is to suffer, which means to listen to him means to listen to one another's suffering. And so on this Transfiguration Sunday, our call is to listen. Hear the stories of one another's struggle and believe them. Listen to the stories of heartbreak, the stories of longing and wanting and hunger. Listen when people tell you that they have mistreated, kicked aside, and left for dead. Listen to the suffering of your neighbor. Try to walk in your enemy's shoes. Look across the aisle to the other side of the tracks. Look into those neighborhoods and towns that you've heard so much about, and listen and see Christ all around you. Listen and you will find the goodness of God right here, right now, where you never thought to look. Much too often we think we know people. Much too often we see our neighbor in an unfortunate situation and we know a piece or two of their story. So we fill in the gaps with assumptions and stereotypes and our own imagination, things we've been told about them. And we think we know everything. But I tell you, you cannot know Christ until you've stopped and listened. I can't tell you how many times I've heard the rest of someone's story, and it absolutely broke my heart, and I stopped judging them immediately. Just listen. Perhaps that story of the boy that the disciples couldn't heal reveals to us that our job isn't to fix or rescue people from their suffering. Perhaps we are simply called to sit with one another and walk with one another in our suffering until Jesus arrives. Listen, because there is nothing more sacred and beautiful and holy and closer to God and Christian than sharing in one another's suffering. People don't need advice. People don't need to be told what they're doing wrong, or that they need to be more correct in their theology or their politics, or that they need right opinions in all these culture wars that we seem to be squabbling about. They just need the faithful presence of another human being. The world's problems may seem like too much. They may feel unsolvable. The poverty and the sickness and the addiction might be too hideous to look at. I assure you, I've never met a pretty poor person's situation. I've never come across someone in a situation of need and went, all that's going to need is that one food box and everything will be made better again. It's ugly. Don't nervously laugh it off, though. Gaze upon their face and listen. Just like that man who lost his dog was demanding that I just listen to his story of pain and weariness. Every person around you just needs to be assured that they are not alone in their suffering. They just need to know that they matter and that there is someone somewhere who will listen, who will stay, who will walk with them through their valleys and dark nights of the soul. Listen, just listen. And just as surely as Peter, James, and John saw Christ on that mountain, you too will see Christ in your neighbor's suffering. And so on Friday morning, I texted the dog owner to see if he found the dog. And this is how he responded. Yes! I can't thank everyone enough for all their help. It truly shows that the spirit of giving, helping, and loving is still in our world. Please share my feelings with everyone. To which I said, I'm a preacher, and I'm going to do just that. I copy and pasted that. I did not embellish that in any way. I looked at the Pleasant View Facebook page, and it was cluttered with everyone celebrating the dog who was found. What began with me nervously laughing at a heartbroken man in my driveway, 3 days later, fully revealed the goodness and loving kindness of our neighbors here in Pleasant View. May Christ be revealed to us in the same way. May we see Christ in our hungry, poor, addicted, lonely neighbors that are all around us. May we transcend our divides, our prejudices, and our resentments to see the face of God in one another. Just listen, and you will see the goodness that you are longing for. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.